and leading nationally from Adelaide when it comes to the issue of social media restrictions. And I think a lot of parents would be cheering him in here, Kerry.
Oh, I absolutely think parents all over the country will be asking, when can we have the same sort of legislation in our state? And does there need to be federal legislation to make sure that it is uniform across the country and enforceable? We've had this conversation previously, Kieran, and I think the thing which most parents will be delighted about is that it takes responsibility in some way away from them by giving them an opportunity to say, well, you're not actually allowed to do this legally anymore. And that means that peer pressure that kids are getting from very early ages. I mean, we know kids are getting phones at, 8, 9, 10. So they're getting it at very early ages. And there are good reasons why children might need phones. It's the access to social media that needs to be curtailed. So good on the Premier. I think he's doing a very good job in all of this. And as I said, I watch with interest to see how long it takes for the other states and perhaps the federal government to take it up.
Bruce Hawker, let's go to that issue of the federal government, because the message from Premier Malinauskas was clear to Michelle Rowland and the federal government, the Communications Minister Michelle Rowland, get on with it. We're not waiting. We need urgency.
Well, he's lost a 12-year-old's vote. That's one thing you can be sure of. But look,
Bruce, there are moves to bring the vote down.
Well, when it gets to that low, I'm chucking it in. But look, I really do think that there's going to be increased pressure on platforms from the federal government and right around the world to not only be providing real leadership in areas like access by young children to the internet, but also the sorts of advertising and other things that are going on under the gaze of platforms and not being properly regulated at the moment. We've already seen some changes by the federal government in recent times around that space, and I think it's only going to increase as time goes by. We've had 30 or more years now of the World Wide Web, and we've got a fair idea about what it's good at and what it's bad at. And I think now, in the next few years, we're going to see governments all around the world and in Australia, probably leading in Australia as well, to start pulling in what they and backing away from some of the things that they've been allowed to do in the past.
Yeah, well, if I was in the government, I'd be grabbing that report from Robert French, the High Court Chief Justice, the former High Court Chief Justice from Malinauskas government, and run with it. Take it and run with it, because he's doing it in South Australia, but Kerry, this is going to be resonating nationwide. Kerry, what did you think of the issue, the stoush between the federal government on another front and the RBA, when Wayne Swan, the former Treasurer, came out and went even harder, much harder than anyone in the current government did?
So Wayne was obviously given the speaking notes about how he could go about attacking the RBA and its independence, and I'm not entirely sure that that's a great thing from a former Treasurer, because you would have thought a former Treasurer would have understood better than most that the RBA is independent of government and they need to be able to act in a way in which they can quite rightly make decisions without political pressure. And they, for them to be blamed for all the economic woes that are now facing the country is a little bit rich, particularly when we know that one of the reasons they're doing what they're doing is to fight inflation. And I have yet to hear an economist in this country here and who hasn't said the reason we've got terrible inflation is because the federal government is spending too much money. They're all agreeing that the expenditure that is going through the federal government is contributing significantly to inflation. So, maybe you look for friends when you're trying to justify your position. And didn't Jim Chalmers used to work for Wayne Swan? I thought that was a pretty close relationship.
It is a very close relationship, that's true. Bruce, is this all about saying this is what we can control, other decisions are being made by the central bank, but trying to inoculate themselves somewhat from the political fallout?
Well, I think it's a fair criticism to say that the RBA doesn't actually have all the answers all the time. We saw what Philip Lowe's mistakes were in 2021 when he said we weren't going to be needing an increase in interest rates until this year. Now they've gone all the way up and they're coming all the way down again. And they've come down on Labor's watch too, by the way. They were up around 7.8% or thereabouts. It's now much lower than that. It's in the threes, but it's still got a way to go. So I don't think it's unfair to say to the RBA, listen, look, you may be really good at economics and statistics and so forth, but have a mind to what's going on in families, households, in the households of families right across Australia at the moment. And that's important for them to have that in the forefront of their minds too, because at the end of the day, it is the RBA that makes those decisions about when the interest rates are going to come down. When it comes to government spending, I just make this point, when you elect a Labor government, you also elect a government which is prepared to look out for the people who are least well off in the community. That's part and parcel of the Labor DNA. It's not necessarily a key factor in the Liberal government's thinking when they're in power. Now, when Labor comes into power, it does actually have to start looking at the worst off in the community, and it has provided some minor benefits to people on pensions and on people on the lowest income in the workforce. I don't think that is a huge contributor to any of the things that we're talking about here. It's got a lot to do with the hangover from the COVID and supply lines and so forth. And what we are seeing around the world, though, is that interest rates are coming down and their central banks are pushing them down. It's not too much to ask for the RBA to be looking closely at that and saying to them, don't drag your feet on this. Make sure you don't get behind the curve, as you did when Philip Lowe was the chairman of the RBA.
Yeah, well, it's going to be important over the coming months ahead of the next election. Kerry, Bruce, thank you both.